Recently, Daystar made the decision to terminate my son Jonathan Lamb's employment.
Following Jonathan Lamb's remarks, nobody was able to speak. He finally discusses the billion-dollar inheritance related to Daystar in a new conversation. His words completely flip the narrative. Money isn't the only consideration. It's about history, family secrets, and an unexpected shift in family power. You were mistaken if you believed you understood what was happening at Daystar. Everything is different now. As a child, Jonathan Lamb had more than simply a fantasy that he would one day run Daystar. You might anticipate it. His father, Marcus Lamb, founded the network from the ground up and turned it into one of the largest Christian media outlets globally. Jonathan wasn't only present. He was preparing to go one step at a time with the torch. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing content. And hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Now, back to the topic. What we were talking about was, the shift plan wasn't merely discussed in passing when Marcus passed away in 2021. It was in writing, sealed, and prepared for action. The future president of Daystar will be Jonathan Lamb. Definitely, not perhaps, not hoping. Everybody in the workplace knew it. It was more than merely doing a task. A heritage was all that it was. Now, a billion-dollar television empire that was viewed by millions of people worldwide was established to remain in the family. Jonathan possessed the blessing, the name, and the knowledge. The majority of people would never doubt that it was the correct course of action. How many people are given that kind of leadership role in writing? Not guessed, assumed, or thought, as promised. Nobody expected the narrative to conclude the way they had anticipated. It might have appeared from the outside that Jonathan was replacing his father. Behind the scenes, however, something quite different was happening. You were under a lot of pressure as vice president to blend in as well as lead. Jonathan was not merely instructed to maintain Daystar. He was requested to continue the narrative. This required protecting the image. Thus, they remained silent on a few points. Even if it didn't feel right, that meant complying with it. That's when things started to go wrong. It's not as though Jonathan and Susie were merely following a media company's trend. They were having painfully quiet conversations at home. They were debating God. They asked some difficult questions. Jonathan wasn't merely acting. He was preparing for a moral upheaval. He understood that accepting the position might require him to compromise all of his values. He realized the gift was more than a title or a cash account. It served as a test. They wanted to see if he would follow the script or God, and how well he followed the rules. At that point, we were more prepared than ever. As a matter of fact, I found it difficult to resist asking God, when will Jonathan be ready? Some may believe that quitting the workplace was easy. If he was sincere, shouldn't the objective come first? Here's the problem, though. Jonathan had no doubts about the mission. The mission had become just that. A faith-based media empire started to feel like just that, a political, financial, and power-based empire. Along the way, the loud machineries of public relations and TV production took the place of God's quiet voice. It hurt Jonathan when he saw it closely. He was aware of his options. He may comply with it and smile for the cameras. He could have everything and maintain harmony. Additionally, he had the option to withdraw from all of the offers made to him. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. That's exactly what he did. Susie and Jonathan were done. They were nearly finished with the title and had a signed plan. They realized that remaining silent would have meant abandoning their convictions, therefore they did it in peace rather than out of resentment or malice. It was a genuine gift. The likelihood was enormous. However, Jonathan was surprised to learn that calling isn't about convenience. It's about abiding by the rules. And occasionally, you have to refuse everything that other people tell you you ought to have. He still has Daystar with him. He gave up. In the process, he received something even more valuable. A clear path, a calm that is impossible to fake on live television, and a pure heart. When people hear the name Lamb, they frequently immediately think of money, especially when Daystar is included. A substantial sum of money. Million-dollar workshops, luxury homes, private aircraft, and expensive clothing. It's simple to understand how Daystar grew into a multi-billion-dollar Christian television conglomerate that distributed programming worldwide. With the cameras, lighting, and skillfully conducted chats, it appeared like there was a great deal of blessing, success, and plenty. As a result, many believe that the family responsible must be extremely affluent, akin to a ministerial dynasty. However, when you remove the layers, that image begins to fade. And what you discover within is a story that is both shocking and unique. For years, Jonathan and Susie Lamb were burdened by that story. They were considered fortunate by those who saw them. They believed that everything in their lives would be covered by their enormous fortune. Naturally, there were occasions when the money arrived. The salary went up if Jonathan took over as the formal head after Marcus Lamb passed away. Both Jonathan and Susie were earning enough money in 2022 to cover their new positions. However, this was overlooked by most. The financial situation did not remain stable for very long. Time went along so slowly, hardly a year. Even when they were well compensated, people didn't believe that. Living in style was not the foundation of prosperity. It was steady. Following years of financial anxiety, lost opportunities, and sacrifices that the majority of people will never witness. For a long time, Susie's pay was not quite 6 figures. In actuality, her pay was lower than that of a full-time employee at a local coffee shop. However, she remained silent. Her greatest passions were raising her children, spending time with her family, and helping others. They didn't travel first class every weekend or construct second homes in the woods. They were paying their bills and managing their debt, just like millions of other American families. Behind the cameras, that was the reality. It wasn't thrilling. It was all right. Then came the decision that altered everything. Susie and Jonathan went out. Not only from their occupations, but from the entire system, the stage, the spotlight, and the notion that their lives were flawless. The promised money ceased to arrive. The fortune that was recorded as theirs was rejected. They quit their employment because their faith compelled them to, not because they were instructed to. The way things were going didn't sit well with them. What they were asked to support did not sit well with them. They also declined to continue the performance. Many claimed that they would sacrifice everything for God. However, when Jonathan and Susie did it, most people didn't understand. You want to leave so much behind, but why? They inquired. Why not remain where you are and improve the situation? However, those individuals were blind to the moments when Jonathan knelt down and battled God. What was stated behind closed doors was not heard by them. The politics, the stress, and the little compromises that gradually sap your spirit. They didn't see Susie staring at their children, thinking what type of legacy they were leaving if they remained silent in order to maintain their employment. In actuality, becoming wealthy through service frequently has a cost. Money isn't the only consideration. You must be aware of when to grin and when to turn away. It's about staying composed. Susie and Jonathan were unable to cross the line. They didn't want to compromise the values they claimed to uphold in order to become success idols. Despite knowing that it would cost them, they left freely, and it did. Their income virtually vanished as soon as they left Daystar. They still needed to feed their children, maintain their home, and pay their expenses. They had no hidden financial reserve. The golden airbag was absent. Despite the lack of a safety net, they had unwavering faith that God would provide for them. One of the most potent aspects of their story is how open and honest they have been about everything. Their chat was free of acting and a pretentious cover narrative. Only 2 individuals seated next to one another acknowledged that they relied on God for everything and were afraid and uncertain. They discussed budgeting, preparing, and surviving. If money grew tight, they suggested, they could have to sell their house. Stories like this are rare in Christian media, yet they may be just what people need to hear. Because this is the reality. The story of the affluent ministerial family has caused a great deal of pain to many individuals. People become overly optimistic as a result. People become envious. It causes individuals to ponder. In the real world, believers are informed that blessings resemble Bentleys and bank accounts, but in reality, they frequently resemble faithfulness during times of loss. The Lambs did not get wealthy. In fact, they went. Perhaps the most significant thing they leave behind is that they demonstrated to us that serving does not guarantee a comfortable life. Sometimes you have to give up everything to follow God, even your platform, your job, and your status, when He calls you in an unexpected way. Susie and Jonathan didn't simply refuse money. They rejected the myth that success in service requires possession of wealth, influence, or power. In the process, they selected something far more valuable: calm. When your bills are paid, you won't be at ease. Knowing that you didn't sacrifice your soul for a title will bring you peace. There is a quiet force to that kind of decision. Given the loud, alluring, and never-ending myth of the affluent ministerial family, this is a tremendously courageous move. Susie Lamb and Jonathan, however, refused to back down. No more, the group declared. They could have played the game, but they chose the harder route. They could have stayed. There was no need to act or pretend. There was no need to buy into a system that rewards silence and punishes conviction. Many people have been terrified to speak the truth aloud, but they did so. Real service is not about money. It's about surrendering. And sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is to give up all that society considers a gift. You can now live your life. For a long time, Jonathan and Susie Lamb lived in a world that was largely invisible to the outer world. Bright lighting, large broadcasts, and a billion-dollar Christian media empire. It's called Daystar. It looked fantastic. Many believed that Jonathan would continue the work that Marcus Lamb, his late father, had begun. He was there, he had the name, and above all, he had the promise. It was documented. He was then supposed to be president. He was responsible for managing the company. However, the majority of people were unaware that something was amiss behind the scenes. Jonathan was not simply bored and left. Although there was a better chance, Susie stayed. They had everything that humans could possibly want: money, safety, and power. Slowly, then louder, they sensed a change beginning within of them. Status was no longer an issue. It was a moral issue. Not everything was fitting together. They were living increasingly contradictory lives to the principles they espoused. And those whose lives were founded on faith could not ignore that crash. Plans that didn't feel like faith were being made behind closed doors. Hints of politics were present. They were protecting more power than people. As they observed more, it became increasingly difficult for them to pretend that everything was fine. They could have stayed, truly. They had the option to keep their names, their employment, and their smiles for the pictures. It would have been easy. But they understood it would be dishonest. Jonathan would pray at night for God to give him strength, a sign, and clarity. Both the whisper of the truth and the weight of his past were tugging at him. Did his father intend for him to live this life? Was maintaining power worth sacrificing peace? In the end, the answer became evident. They weren't prepared to sacrifice everything they held dear in order to stay. This certainly applies to them, their children, and their faith. It wasn't a spectacular explosion when they decided to go. It was silent, somber and solemn. As they considered the life they were creating, they posed a challenging question to one another. Is this what God truly desires for us? When the response was given, there were neither cheers nor rockets. It was filled with terror, sorrow, and a profound sense of calm. They were prepared to release everything. People were taken aback. Why would they sacrifice their future, their steady income, and their global influence? However, most people were unaware that the Lambs were not leaving their employment. A system that no longer matched their spirit was removed when they departed. The demands, the politics, and the commotion were too much for them to bear, so they were leaving. It was very expensive. Their affluence was not concealed. No $1 million exit present was given. Their house still needed to be paid. They needed to pay their debts. They were afraid. But they were free. Peace, according to Susie, is more than simply not having any issues. It entails acting morally even at the expense of everything. That's exactly what they were doing. They didn't depart furious, which makes their narrative compelling. Nobody was harmed by them. They placed no blame. The only things they said no more to were no longer true. They chose conviction over ease, trust over fear, and serenity over pandemonium that day. Since then, their lives have taken a different turn. Simple, sincere obedience was the norm every day. There were no grand stages or corporate brands. It's true, but it's not pretty. And in a society where performance is constantly praised, that kind of honesty is noteworthy. We can learn from their narrative that leaving does not necessarily imply failure. Sometimes they are brave enough to do that. Jonathan and Susie had the option to continue the act, but they chose not to. They are now living evidence that serenity does not come from clinging on. It results from surrender. What made them depart, then? Because they were forced to. Because their spirits were more important to them than money. Speaking the truth was more vital than tradition. And lastly, since in the end, nothing is worth sacrificing all for, not a title, no legacy, and no church empire. Sometimes what you create doesn't have the greatest impact. What you're willing to give up will determine this. And that is the fascinating aspect of their narrative. They had it all to themselves. The power, the respect, the history, and the stage. Susie Lamb and Jonathan Lamb were perfectly positioned to seize control of Daystar, a global Christian empire. Everything Marcus Lamb had constructed over the years was easily accessible. The table had keys on it. They opened the doors. He would be president, it was written down, and it was signed. However, they chose to walk away rather than assume that power. Many would never have. Many folks don't. People rarely voluntarily cede power, especially when it was granted to them without resistance. In this world, influence is sometimes confused with effect and ambition with calling. But that's what makes the decision made by Jonathan and Susie so odd, so honest, so painful, and perhaps even so sacred. Let's face it, power is good. With the microphone and the space, it feels even more good to be noticed and acknowledged. On a deep level, it makes us all feel wonderful. Furthermore, leaving becomes even more difficult when the language of service is used to convey power. It goes beyond a job. The reason for its existence. That's what God wants. History is what it is. Those things are difficult to let go of. However, the reality is that a person's career and calling don't always align. Slowly and horribly, Jonathan and Susie had to confront that. At first, everything appeared to be going well. For many years, Jonathan had been a part of Daystar. He was the son of the founder and had earned his position not only by his last name but also by his service. Susie was by his side, supporting him, working, and raising their family while maintaining their strong religious beliefs. They were not only occupying a place of worship. They were shaped by it and had roots in it. Then the time came for Jonathan to receive written confirmation that he would be elected president. It was more than a guess. It was not considered. It was discussed, decided upon, and planned. Everyone in the area was aware of what was about to occur. Following Marcus Lamb's death, Jonathan was appointed vice president. Susie also received a significant pay increase. For the first time in a long time, things appeared stable. They had their money safe. No more barely surviving. You don't have to speculate about how difficult the upcoming season will be. They had a good home and a reliable source of income, so the future appeared bright. In order to reap the rewards of their dedication and receive what had been promised, it would have been wonderful to settle down and remain there. However, I didn't feel well. Since there was no peace despite the existence of the money. They could see the station, but they were in a bad mood. They were not in agreement, but they did have authority. Furthermore, that kind of emotional anguish cannot be purchased with money. Beyond what was visible to those outside the workplace, much was happening behind the scenes. With decisions being made, standards being reduced, and facts being concealed, Jonathan and Susie were struggling. They believed that in order to maintain harmony, they needed to play the game, be calm, and refrain from fighting. But what if they were dying of silence? What if, in order to maintain harmony, they had to depart? Making a decision like that takes time. It is quite painful and takes a long time. Tears, prayers that don't seem to be heard, and late-night conversations. Thoughts that are persistent. They weren't angry. They weren't upset. They simply didn't feel comfortable. The first thing to breach the safety wall is worry. They changed their minds when they realized that continuing would have meant failing themselves, not because the ministry failed them. They would have been forced to act, ignore, and support things they didn't truly believe in if they had stayed. And when faith becomes action, it ceases to be faith. It becomes a matter of survival. Thus, they took a decision that surprised a lot of people. No, they said. They said no to fame, money, and power. They relinquished the title. The history was abandoned by them. They sacrificed everything because they understood they couldn't continue without losing their identity, not because it was on fire. They kept quiet about it. There won't be any social media storms, dramatic exits, or press conferences. It was merely a courteous, sorrowful, and silent departure. Their actions were motivated by their conviction that obeying God's commands was more significant than receiving credit from others, not by disobedience. When they made that decision, they didn't simply lose power. Some bosses never realize how much they've won. Calm. It's not the kind that comes from having a large stage or a lot of money. The level of certainty that comes from knowing that you belong where no one else does. The kind that results from releasing burdens that you were never intended to bear. Perhaps more of that kind of direction is needed in the church. The kind that is willing to give up, not the kind that clings to power. Not the type that must converse with others to feel significant, the type that is aware of when to keep silent. The kind of person who, out of dignity, breaks down the ladder rather than climbs it. Susie and Jonathan are both flawed. They never claim to be. But in a world full of well-known preachers and persuasive speeches, their story is unique. It's true. It's accurate. There is a great deal of hardship. However, it possesses a peculiar, silent courage that is difficult to locate. At the moment, they are not attempting to build a large company. They have no desire to launch a new brand. Their only hope is to survive. They still need to move their home and pay their expenses. Millions are not lying around with them. They also agree with that since peace is more significant than strength. We should all be prompted to consider what we're clinging to and why by their story, especially those in authority. Must question whether the goal we have is truly divinely inspired or only a phony sense of accomplishment. Lastly, keep in mind that if we find ourselves out of line, it's never too late to lay it down. Bigger leaders are not needed for this group of people. It requires more courageous people. Leaders who choose peace over power, belief over usability, and character over charm. Additionally, Jonathan and Susie Lamb have become peculiar examples of that. They gave up on the throne, not because they battled for it. And perhaps that is what, in the end, makes them true leaders.